there are big issues. And obviously, in terms of linkages, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some sort of corridors between various places. These corridors don't necessarily have to be places that are absolutely ideal for wild dogs. They've essentially got to have enough resources that enable dogs to get from core area to core area. They don't actually have to have resident animals. Natural dispersal linkages, they can reduce the metapopulation intensity or the management intensity. What we have in South Africa at the moment is a managed metapopulation system where you've got wild dogs in small fenced-off reserves. And what we're trying to do is manage those all collectively as one population, but it is very intensive in terms of having to physically move animals from place to place to maintain the genetics. If you've got dispersing animals, you can't let them just go running around all over the place because there are conflict mitigation issues you have to deal with as well. So sometimes, in appropriate circumstances, corridors and linkages can alleviate some of those problems. And then it's also just very expensive. If you're looking at moving animals around the country, that requires aeroplanes, veterinarians, things like that. It can be very expensive. One of the downsides, though, of landscape linkages is that it can take a lot of money, though, to actually initially start those up, and then obviously to maintain them as well, whether it's fences or neighbour relations. So how does it relate to wild dogs? Well, the reality is that there's very few wild dogs left. In South Africa, we've got less than 450 wild dogs. And they've been exported from 25 of the original 39 countries on the continent that they used to occur in. Kruger National Park has got the bulk of the wild dogs. They've got the only viable population in the country. The next biggest single population is in Mfolozi Park. 1997, there was a PHVA that was dealing with wild dog conservation. And basically what came out of it was essentially that we needed to look for new areas to re-establish wild dog populations and to try and potentially put them back into places where there were dogs historically, and to link them through to other areas. So try and establish these linkages. And then just to give KZN's importance in this whole thing, out of those 450, there's about 140 wild dogs in KZN. This figure, it does change from time to time. Dog populations fluctuate quite quickly. And since this study, there have been 2 small areas which have got dogs as well. Let's just give you an idea. When we started the study, there were 3 reserves. There was Mfolozi, Tanda Private Game Reserve, and Kuzi Game Reserve. Those are the spots that did have populations of dogs. Subsequent to this study, there have been dogs reintroduced into Hlamanyati, which is now called Zamanga, and then up into Tembi as well. But you'll see how it fits into the bigger scheme of things just now. So a couple of the aims of the study was obviously to determine the different environmental variables that determine or influence where dogs move once they leave these subpopulation reserves. And then obviously we're trying to identify potential linkages that we can then work on later in terms of trying to formulate some sort of structure to link these different properties up. And then obviously predict habitats which dogs are most likely to use in future if they do break out of particular reserves, and see what the variables are influencing where they are going to go. So in terms of collecting the data, dogs were radio tracked. What the policy in KZN is that essentially what they're trying to do is get at least one collar on every pack in the province. So whether it's a reserves mandate or whether it's from a research point of view, a lot of these dogs have got collars on them. And when they move out of the reserves, it does enable you to obviously try and follow them, particularly following up on sightings reports and things like that are also all adds to the information there. Out of those dogs that we put GPS collars on, only one actually broke out of the reserve and started moving around. So that collar data that came from that GPS collar was incorporated into sightings data we had after following VHF collars. So 131 of those location points were determined in that manner. And then there were 53 that were reported sightings. So that was when we went out and investigated if a sighting of a wild dog was in fact actually a wild dog. This one at the bottom, just to give you an example, these were police out near Babananga that reported these wild dogs that were killing cattle. So it gives you a bit of an idea of the issues that you are dealing with. A lot of the reports we found were either jackal or spotted hyena or just domestic dogs. So we had to sift all of those out through a series of information sheets. And then also, just to avoid autocorrelation, we decided to cut these points down to 1 a day. So we took the earliest point in a day that was found, rather than potentially getting 3 different reports in different areas of these dogs, which could actually bias some of the information. So that got us down to 132 location points, and that was either 40 different individuals or groups that were out at the time. So then the modeling part of it. We used maximum entropy modeling. One of the good things about it was that it allowed us to use both continuous and categorical data. And we only had points. We essentially had location points of where these animals were, not where they weren't. So this modeling program allows us to do that. We took a lot of the data sets that, so KZN Wildlife have produced quite a few really good data sets that enable us to factor in some of these different variables. We converted them all to the same size, so they're obviously comparable. And then, we used, and this is a really key point here, because when you see the maps that are generated, it's not saying that the dispersal habitat is the only stuff available. It's basically saying, based on the reserves that we had populations of dogs in, when the dogs left, this is where we would assume the corridors and the linkages to be best placed. It's not saying it's the only habitat. Wild dogs are habitat generalists, so they will survive in a lot of different areas, but these are the areas that they're focused on based on actual dispersals. So modelling, I mean, there's a lot of debate as to which environmental variables you work on, which are probably going to be the most likely ones that are going to be factoring in on where dogs move. So a digital elevation model was very important for us. We felt it was going to be a key variable. The topographic classification, there was one that had 10 classifications, which included things like woodland and bushland. Land cover, there was another one that was quite detailed that had 39 different classes. And we lumped those together in what we considered to be 11 appropriate classes. Sometimes there'd be various splits amongst those classes, which we felt didn't need to be so fine and detailed. Distance to river courses, there were a lot of times where dogs were breaking out of reserves, leaving at river courses, sometimes just because the fence line itself was very difficult to maintain at those points. And we suspected that those river courses themselves, or the prey that were available, those all might sort of influence it. Human density, obviously we were wondering if the clusters of houses and things like that would influence where animals are going. Road density as well, where they're going to be using roads or where they're avoiding things like traffic. And obviously distances to roads as well. It does have a bit of an influence, and obviously when you're getting reported sightings and people are saying, well, we saw a dog on a road, you have to try and evaluate a little bit whether it's actually because the dogs are preferring roads, or it's just that's where the people are actually seeing them more often than not. So just to get some idea, some of the outputs of this modelling system, this is one of them just to help you evaluate whether your predictions are any good or worth any value. This had an AUC of greater than 0.9, so it was considered to be quite a useful predictor of where these dogs were going and what variables were being used. These jackknife outputs, it just gives you an indication of the influence on the variables on the sort of the final model, and it gives the idea of relative importance of each variable, either by itself or when you're including all the other different variables. So obviously based on this, the digital elevation model was shown to be quite important. But a lot of these you can see greater than 0.6, so they are a little bit greater than just random. Obviously land cover was quite significant as well. Some of the other outputs it gives you a slightly more detailed breakdown of each of these different variables that you're working with. So for example, out of the land cover, woodland was number 8. So it gives you an indication over here of how significant it was compared to the other different variables. And then based on those curves, you can sort of get an idea of at what elevation dogs would prefer, densities, things like that. But it gives you a much better picture of what you're dealing with rather than just seeing a map that's spewed out at the end of it. So just to give an idea, these variables, elevation, land cover, road density, and human density, were the ones that, when combined, gave us the greatest idea of where these dogs are most likely to go. In terms of terrain, the dogs were preferring an area between 130 and 330 meters above sea level. Bushland was the only other land cover apart from woodland, which was the most preferred land cover, that was actually showing any sort of present probability of greater than random. The wild dogs were tending to avoid areas of higher density, and interestingly enough, they were found most frequently in areas of road density of about 0.7 kilometers per kilometer squared. Interestingly enough, you're reading papers about wolves in North America, they follow a very similar trend, where they actually are, when they're dispersing, they're found in areas that are also 0.7 kilometers per kilometer squared. And this is the thing that gets everybody excited, particularly landowners, is what are these dogs eating when they're going outside? It was a big part of what we wanted the study to be, but obviously it's very difficult to evaluate what dogs are eating outside of these protected areas. Once they're moving out, if you get a sighting report, unless it's eating somebody's cow or goat, you're probably not going to hear about what they've been feeding on. So we had to try and have a little look at the data that we were getting and the outputs that we were getting there, and looking at previous studies. So some of the studies that have been taking place in HRP before, guys had seen that the dogs were preferring woodland habitat in these areas. They were also showing that, obviously with wild dogs preferring Inyala and Impala in KZN, looking at these habitats are the most likely to have these prey. Inyala, red duiker, and bushbuck are the 3 herbivore species most closely associated with woodland habitat, and the Impala prefer the slightly more open bushland habitat. So what we're suspecting is that obviously they have a preference for these lower lying areas with this sort of woodland, bushland habitat, and we suspect it might be related to the prey that's out there. One of the difficult things is that we can't be absolutely certain. It's very difficult to evaluate prey populations outside of these protected areas. Obviously there's frequent game counts going on in the parks, but outside of the parks, it's very difficult to conduct those kind of studies, particularly over such vast areas. Some of these dogs are traveling sort of 300, 400 kilometers in a round trip. One of the other things that we used was speaking to some of the chaps in Zimbabwe and some of the papers that have been published. It appears that wild dogs, and I don't think it's unique to wild dogs, are probably large carnivores as well. When there's very little natural prey available, they are more likely to take livestock. And certainly in the bulk of the cases we had, there was very little livestock taken outside of these protected areas. We were taking very little livestock. We're saying in one incident of a month and a half where the dogs ran about 300 kilometers, there were 3 goats and 2 cows that were killed in that entire time. So considering that a dog has to eat fairly frequently, or a pack of dogs has to eat fairly frequently, they've got to be feeding on something. So just to give an indication, this is one of the density maps that you can see here. This isn't a max in output. But what you can see is these little black dots over here. These are all sightings reports or data that we got of dogs outside of their subpopulation reserves. It's a little bit tricky to see at the back, but this gives an indication of human density, and you can see that these are following a little bit of a circle around kind of an area of very low human density. In the middle here is Nongoma. This is Mfolozi Park. Looking down at Durban, so you can see the difference in density. What we aren't saying necessarily that dogs are avoiding these people because there's some sort of an experience, maybe a bad experience with people, but it could just be that the habitat itself is so modified that there's nothing for them there. As with other studies, there was a study in Kenya and Laikipia as well, where the guys found that low activity roads could be attracting dogs. It could be an easy opportunity for dogs to move through areas. There's not a massive threat if there's not a huge amount of vehicle traffic going through there. Similar studies have found that wolves have taken a similar route as well. So it might show that even though there are high densities of humans in various places, because of the clustering of a lot of these communities, there might actually be opportunity for dogs to move fairly close to human habitation, but not necessarily be avoiding it directly. So it does allow us to look at various linkages which possibly might not have been completely appropriate because the habitat isn't ideal. So based on those reserves where the dogs were at that stage, this was kind of what was coming out in terms of preference, in terms of dispersal routes. You guys will probably be able to see the outline of Mfolozi here quite clearly. It just seems that dogs were following, even though they were outside of the reserve, those data points weren't based on those particular parks themselves. It seems to be showing that a couple of the reserves where dogs did exist actually were pretty good habitat, and dogs were replicating that outside. The stuff that we find very interesting and it's very useful for our work is when you start overlaying the various conservation areas, so the private reserves, the government reserves, conservancies, things like that, you start overlaying it on the areas that dogs are focusing on. It is quite encouraging, and some of the earlier talks is quite bleak to see dogs getting snared and run over in cars and animals getting poisoned, but there actually is some positive news here. There's a couple of reserves there that are really cooperating at the moment. Tanda Private Game Reserve and Mkuzi Game Reserve really are sitting in a core area there. There's cooperation from other areas like Zululand Rhino Reserve, which is just up this side here, and then looking into Zimbabwe, which is a little bit north of that. So we have got opportunity to expand it, and a considerable proportion of the suitable land does fall within protected areas. What's interesting out here is that I think it would probably have to be remodeled again based on Tembe and where dogs have gone out of Tembe, because that habitat's not included. It's not to say the area is not ideal, it's just saying that dogs weren't going there in that particular time. I think if you had to take in things like sand forest or some of those grassland areas into southern Mozambique, it would probably expand that area there as well. And just some of the conservation implications. I mean, there is suitable habitat. Some of the suitable habitat isn't ideal. Some of it's fragmented, but it does enable us to look at patches that can be linking these different areas up. And then particularly at the bottom as well, a lot of focus has been on whether wild dogs can be sustainably kept in these areas, whether there's some sort of purpose for having them other than purely an ecological purpose, which a lot of people don't necessarily recognize as something as significant. Maybe the conflict situation outweighs the reason of having them just for an ecological reason. Ecotourism hasn't really been investigated. There's some studies that have shown that it can offset itself, particularly when the impact on the prey is quite low. It's something we are looking at the moment. It's something that really does have a lot of scope to be investigated, particularly in northern KZN. I think Enrico's work has shown now that there's certainly a scope to work down that line. So if we can link them all up and get the linkages connected in with where those areas are showing sort of high ecotourism value and potential, there's definitely something that can be worked there for the benefit of the dogs. So some of these challenges, the edge effects, particularly when these areas are being fragmented, that's a wild dog that had his penis sheath snared. These are very real problems for dogs when they're moving outside of these protected areas. They are encountering snares, they are getting hit by cars. What we need to try and work on, particularly because dogs are not necessarily sticking in these defined fenced areas, some of them are moving out, particularly dispersal animals, there's got to be a bit more consideration towards cooperatively managing these animals. They're not just going to sit in a defined area like perhaps a rhino would be if it's been forced to sit in a particular area. Livestock compensation, it's a very debatable issue. It's something we have looked at, and it is very open to abuse. There are policies in place at this stage to compensate people for livestock, but people have to be there to investigate it very clearly. There's also a huge gap in terms of husbandry of livestock. I think a lot of people have seen, if you drive through Zululand, you see a lot of goats and cows sitting on roads, being stolen at night, things like that. It's something that really needs to be taken into account. Then promoting the financial implications of having dogs, working with game farmers, guys that are selling in Nyala, wild dogs moving onto their property, needing their Nyala, they're not going to be very happy. It's something that we have to try and come to some sort of a compromise on. And then obviously the financial implications of formal linkages. As I said before, there are issues with that. There are issues with people dropping their fences. It's something we have to take serious consideration to. And then obviously just cooperation. I mean, wild dogs do generate an enormous amount of politics on the ground, at government level. It's quite controversial at times. And it's something that's probably, if it's going to work, that's going to be the biggest issue, is actually getting guys talking about it. And then obviously these are everybody that's been involved over the time. So that's pretty much it, eh?
Thank you very much, Brendan. That was fantastic. We've got a couple minutes for questions. Are there any questions?
Brendan, I was wondering whether you're thinking of actually including the model with more data being collected in the future. Because one of the aspects actually we're limited to a very short period of time, so you can only account for a limited number of variables.
Yeah.